So every once in a while, I get to try to provoke conversation on a topic that is kind of right at the center of the stuff that I'm working on, and frankly, right at the center of the stuff that I feel like describes where I'm broken. And oftentimes what I'm doing is trying to turn those into series, because there's 52 weeks in a year, and it's good job security / it's important to have those good series. But every once in a while, there's something that just doesn't fit, or it's too raw to fit yet, and I don't understand it well enough yet, and yet it just seems like we need to talk about it. And so this morning is one of those, which means I also have to put out there, like, I might not be right on this one. And I think that's true every weekend, but more so than normally, I just kind of want to go, like, there's some stuff that I think is worth considering, and I don't think we have to agree on this, but I do think that it's important that we wrestle with it, because if it's true, the axis of everything kind of changes, and it dislodges a lot of what it means to be a parent, a friend, a leader in relationship in general. And I think it coincides with what we're doing in Advent. So let me just kind of restart before we start. We've started this conversation, and in the first week we talked about gratitude. And in an effort to go, like, how could we move toward Christmas Eve with a little bit greater connection and intentionality? We started by talking about gratitude and really just talked about this invitation to kind of see life from right here, to see the details that we oftentimes miss. And one of the ways that we talked about, and this is an ancient practice, is just picking a time in your day, your drive to work, your drive home from work, while you're brushing your teeth, while you're taking a shower, while you're walking to school, while you're walking to fifth period, whatever, where you just identify to yourself in your own guts, to God, 10 things that you're thankful for. And so I thought we might just give you a second to do that, just right where you're at, just identifying maybe 10 things that you're thankful for. And I was going to bring my beverage and I forgot. So ready, go. And that's kind of the theory, right? Is it creates a deep breath. And then last week we talked about patience, and really what we talked about last week was focus, that within the Advent tradition, there aren't a lot of topics that tend to be pretty regular, but this one is, and it's this time of year where we don't just look towards the fact that Jesus came, but it's a time where we reflect on the bigger picture. It's the opposite of this. It's this. We zoom out and look at the bigger picture of the implications that he's coming back. And for many of us, that's a topic we avoid, myself included, because it's so charged, and there's so many of these kind of weird, awkward connections, and the Armageddon stuff, and the Kirk Cameron stuff, and all this stuff that we don't even know what to think about anymore, but we know that it doesn't necessarily help us parent or spouse or work better tomorrow, and so sometimes we just don't have the luxury to think about it. But patience is this opportunity to go, okay, God, how am I doing in the bigger picture? And the invitation of last week, and my hope was that if you're interested in praying it, you did so before we took communion, which was just to say, God, if there's something about my overall 30,000-foot focus as a follower of you, if you need to interrupt me in some way and talk to me about that, then I just invite you to do so. And my hope is that some of you experienced some presence with God within all of that. This morning, what I want to talk about is humility. But humility is like those other words, patience and gratitude, that we're just like, if we're not careful, we're so familiar with them, we just get nauseated and fall asleep because we don't really actually think in those virtue terms anymore. And so the construct that I want to give you, and again, this is that, like, I might not be right on this, but I definitely think it's worth thinking about, especially as you process what it means to be human in God's world and have relationship with people. And it's this idea of left-handed versus right-handed power. Now, I don't expect that to make sense, of course, right away. My hope is to give some explanation to that. The phrase was actually originally coined by Martin Luther. So it's been around for quite some time, 500 or so years. But it's something that seems like we've dropped along the road, and I'm wondering if maybe we would do well to pick it back up. And here's the way I'm going to frame it to you, hopefully beginning and end, is what if God wants to teach us to live with our right hand behind our back? Now, let me just say, like, some of you are left-handed, you're not right-handed, and a few of you are ambidextrous, and so I don't know what you do with this analogy. But so please don't be offended. Of course, what we're talking about is your dominant hand, but the question is, what if what it means to be God's, and what it means to follow after him in this world is to learn from him to live with our right hand behind our back? You know, one of the areas where I've been thinking about this, and this is where it kind of is close to home for me, is for years I've realized I don't just have anxiety, and I don't mean to trivialize anxiety or the medical side of that in any sense of the word, But another way I've been saying it to myself for years is, one way to say it, Adam, is you have anxiety. The other way to say it is you're addicted to control. And when you don't have it or think you don't, you get sick. And again, I'm not trying to in any way trivialize the whole medical establishment and the brain side of that. But therefore, for a long time now, and especially more recently, because there's several people who have become a part of this community who are really connected through AA, and listening to their recovery stories has been challenging to me. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this is, what if I related to my addiction to control the way an alcoholic relates to their drink? Which isn't to imply that we're all alcoholics. I'm not saying that at all. But there's something that I admire about their approach when they get into that recovery mode. Because as I understand it, it starts by waking up in the morning and saying, "Hi, God, my name is," you fill in the blank, "and I'm an alcoholic." And one of my friends who shares this with me, he says he always laughs when he gets to that part because he's like, "What am I telling God my name for? Of course he knows my name and that I'm an alcoholic. Why am I doing this?" But there is a confession in there, isn't there? There's this confession that there's this thing called alcoholism that's in many ways greater than me, and left by myself, I can't do it. And yet I'm acknowledging to you, God, that I don't want to be that person. And if I'm not careful, that person will be controlled by alcohol, and so I need your help. It's this acknowledgement that alcohol doesn't give me life. It's robbing me of life. That it doesn't enhance my relationships. It destroys my relationships. And part of what I admire are those who are still regularly, some of my friends, several decades into their sobriety, and yet still regularly a part of meetings. And what they'll tell me is that the purpose of those is in large part to get together and share stories of triumph. And at the same time, of course, what comes out is stories of struggle. And that whether their sobriety is 3 weeks old or 30 years old, what they're struck by is a reminder of the power of this thing that they're facing, and that if they'll allow it to, it will ruin their life. But if they'll lean into others and they'll lean into God, they can be rescued. So I come back to my original question. Here's what I've been wondering. What if I related to my need for control on those terms? In fact, I experimented with a little bit this week. At one point, I was setting 1-hour alarms where I just, every time my alarm went off at an hour, I was just kind of going, "Okay, Lord, I'm a control freak, and I understand that doesn't help anyone, including myself or you. It just ruins relationships. Please help me." And what if, though it's not my motive because talk is cheap and I prefer talk, like what if you had a community of people where you were saying to one another every day, "Listen, I'm a control freak, and I think if I let it, it'll ruin my life and everybody around me, but I don't want that to be the case." Now, the reason why I think that's valuable as we talk about humility as we move towards Christmas is I frankly think that Christmas might be the best time of year to talk about this. I mean, think of the Christmas story, because I think the Christmas story begs us to ask this question: what if God doesn't do power the way we have been told that he does power? Well, what if it doesn't work like that? And what if Christmas exposes that? In the Gospel of John, the 4th Gospel, in chapter 1, says this: "He was in the world." We're talking about Jesus. "He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." So we're talking about Jesus. Question is, what stands out to you here? And what does God want to stand out to us here? In some sense, that's why we're here, is to gain some level of awareness. And here's what stands out to me. A control freak couldn't roll like that. That if God is the most preeminent, most important, most all-powerful being in the universe, as Christ's followers claim, and if he does control the way we think he does control, could he possibly handle being in his world and not being recognized as all the things that he is, and not controlling everything around him? I mean, think of the infancy narratives, and we're going to explore this a little bit more on Christmas Eve, but just think of the absurdity of the infancy stories, those stories around Jesus' birth. So God decides he's going to become a human, fully God, fully divine. Hard to understand. We'll explore that a little bit more in a little bit. He decides he's going to become human. So what kind of human does this God become? A 32-year-old king of the most powerful army in the world with the greatest resource of wealth. Like, isn't that the way you would do it if you did this story the way you do power? Like, he's going to show up at the pinnacle of wealth and health and knowledge and control, and he's going to set the world to right. No, that's not the story, is it? He shows up how? As an infant, a newborn, dependent on others to the extent that even like getting out of the chute would require the help of someone not himself. Several someones, to be honest. And so, okay, so he decides to become a baby, and someone's got to feed him, and someone's got to change his diapers, and someone's got to look after him, and yeah. So he's born to some parents who live in a palace, and he's going to be their fifth child. Why the fifth child? Well, because the first child gets hosed, right? Like, because we're making all our mistakes on the first child, and so he's not. I mean, wouldn't you, if you were God, make sure that the Messiah came as the sixth or the seventh or the eighth child of yours, because you know too well all the mistakes you made on especially the first, not to mention all the others, right? Like, this week it finally occurred to me, I think I know why the firstborn gets the inheritance, right? It's an apology for the lifetime of mistakes that's been made on their behalf, right? No, he comes as a firstborn, not to a prince or a princess or a king, to a 12-year-old girl. Not in a palace, in the backwoods of some obscure part of the kingdom. I mean, and then think of how inept the dad is. Hey, honey, I know you're, 30 weeks pregnant or whatever it was, but we're going to go on a road trip. We're going to go back. Can you imagine being the poor parents of Mary? I knew she shouldn't have got involved with that Joseph. Like, that moron took her to Bethlehem, and they had the baby in a sheep pen. I mean, my point in being a little absurd is to go, what does the Christmas story expose about the way this God does control? And is it possible that the right-handed way is not all that represented in the story that's supposed to be the culmination of God's revelation? Is it possible that God doesn't do power the way we do? And that Christmas begs us to think differently about that, to think about humility in completely different terms. Dallas Willard is one of my all-time favorite thinkers. He was a very prestigious professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California. He's recently passed. Then while he's distinguished as a theologian, he was even more distinguished as a philosopher. And I heard a story years ago where he was in a class in which it became known to these very intellectual, idealistic, brilliant college students that he was a Christ follower. And they kind of took him to task. What ensued was a lengthy conversation where they were asking all kinds of questions, but apparently it was a pretty kind exchange, and he had good answers and they had good questions. But toward the end, there was a particular student who started to phrase a series of questions in a way that was easily perceived as aggressive and a little bit know-it-all-ish and kind of gotcha in nature. And it took several minutes for this student to make his point. And everyone there who assumed that Christ followers don't have an answer for questions like these could kind of see that Dallas was cornered. And when the student finished, he purportedly turned and looked at the clock and saw that they had about 2 minutes left in class, and he said, "Well, I can see that class is over. You're dismissed." Now, to everyone in the class, or at least almost everyone, it looked like weakness. It looked like he'd failed. Many of these people who were convinced that there wasn't a good explanation for Jesus left being convinced that one of their best thinkers was just stumbled by a 19-year-old college student. And after everyone was gone, there was one girl who remained in class, and she approached Dallas and graciously, and yet with some honesty and some frustration in her voice, said, "I don't understand. Because I know you have the answer to the question, and I would love to know the answer. And even more importantly, you just made our faith look like a facade to a whole bunch of highly intelligent people. What were you thinking?" And he said, "I was practicing the discipline of not needing to have the last word." And that was that. My question is that absurd? Or is that an understanding of the heart of God that does power differently than the way we do and the way we think he does? Nobody needs me to point out to them that we are surrounded by people who are turning not so much from Jesus, but from the Bible in all of its oftentimes perceived as absurd kind of claims. At the very top of that list is this God, right? And I think the question we have to ask is, if God is the all-wise, all-powerful, all-knowing being that we say that he is, if that's the case, then why is he so slow in getting on with repairing the world? If God is in fact who I believe he is and many of you believe he is, then how do we explain the delay in fixing things? If this God wants to remake the world, then why doesn't he knock some heads together and put some corpses under some flat rocks and get on with the story? And yet, I think the text begins to expose, and I'm grateful for those who've helped me see this, not the least of which is a guy named Robert Ferrara Capone. I put together what I hope is a pretty good bibliography on the mind map because I know that there's a lot to think about here. But he points out that God actually did do that early in the story. There's a story that probably everyone here, no matter how familiar you are or aren't with the Bible, is aware of. It's the story of Noah. And in the story of Noah, God gets so frustrated with people in his creation that he decides he's more or less going to flush the toilet, get rid of everybody except for a few, and that'll solve his problems. And yet the story resolves itself in a completely different way. Towards the end of Genesis chapter 8, it says, "Never again," this is God, "never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." Now again, don't get hung up on whether this is literal or not. I don't think it matters. What it is for sure is a community of people trying to be aware of God and discern who he is and the way he's leading them, and somehow these people responded to a narrator claiming that whatever that was, God didn't necessarily like it. The story continues with a very famous, important covenant. "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come." And listen to this. "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it'll be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I'll see it and remember the everlasting covenant." I got to get a bigger Bible. I'm 40 now. I can't read this thing. "I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures and every kind on the earth." So God, he does this right-handed thing. And at least as these people understood it, when it was all over and the dust settled, no pun intended, God takes his bow, that's the word rainbow. Those of you who are archery hunters, this is your text. Maybe it's your wife's text, because what he does is he takes his bow and he sets it aside. And God says, I've got this means of taking charge, and I'm setting it aside. And the claim of these people was that every time we see a rainbow, we're to see a story of a God who thinks about power in such a way that his means of just taking charge and knocking heads together and making it all happen is over there. In fact, some point out he doesn't just set his bow aside, he points it at himself. My question is, what if God doesn't do power the way we think that he does? See, right-handed power is straight-line power. Right-handed power, it's the power of the punch. It's the power of the fastball. It's the power of coercion. Right-handed power is the power of a strong statement, a great thesis. Left-handed power, it's by definition paradoxical. If right-handed power is a 102-mile-an-hour fastball, left-handed power is a curveball that looks like it doesn't know what it's doing and then drops into the zone at just the right time. Think brushing your teeth with your left hand, which your dentist will like because it's easier on your gums, I'm reminded every 6 months. Think eating your spaghetti with your left hand. Think putting your contacts in, or here you go, guys, but make sure your wife has Christmas pictures first. Think shaving with your left hand. It's paradoxical. See, the right-handed power is perfect for getting the spaghetti from the plate to your mouth. But what is it not good for? It's perfect for saving the 4-year-old from falling off the cliff. But what is it not good for? Well, try that with your 14-year-old. Try it with a 20-year-old. Try it with an adult. And I wonder if what we begin to expose is that God's priorities are relationship far more than mine often are. That, yeah, right-handed power might get things done, but left-handed power, it does too, but it's just in a different form. And here's the struggle, and I share it with you. I'm assuming some of you are way ahead of me on this, and you're like, I can't believe I'm going to church, because this is why I don't go to church, because it's this namby-pamby, sit around and wait for God to do everything for me, and I just don't think that's the way the world works. We've created this dichotomy that says either, and I relate to it. Like, to whatever degree I feel somewhat responsible for whatever success I've had, the confusion for me is, God, that's been my right hand. It's the ability to stay persistent, to walk through walls, to do the types of things that good leaders do, to not take no for an answer, to go for it, to be tenacious. And we contrast that with the person who's 130 years old and still living on their parents' couch and praying every day that God will give them some direction. And my question is, what if we've created for ourselves a false dichotomy? A very convenient one, because it leaves two options, neither of which are all that appealing, but one of them is far more appealing to the other than the other, especially in a room like this. That if we're going to err to the side of being a people with a bias for action, and I couldn't agree more. But what if the text tells a story of a God who goes, yeah, I tried it. Some would point out that after Noah's story, God leads with his left hand moving forward. That when he does get involved, it gets us, we talked about this a couple years ago, there's this present passive wrath of God, that whenever it's happening in real time, it tends to be a consequence, not something God is doing. And when God is talking about his supposed wrath, he's often talking about it in the future as something he will do, and yet the future just kind of is like the carrot on the stick, it keeps moving. That what we see from Genesis 9 on is a God who does power differently. You can see where I say, like, if this is true, it changes everything, but be careful. You better spend some time with it before you decide that it does, because it completely changes the definition of a win. Here's the driving question for me is, what if Jesus actually had to learn left-handed power? Now, that could get dangerous, but this is, remind ourselves, and I'm sorry if this is too much theology for you, but Christology is the celebration of Jesus as being fully God, fully divine. And over the course of history, the pendulum swings. A Christology that centers too much on the fact that Jesus was God, it treats him like a Marvel superhero character. It says that Jesus knew the temple was going to fall, not because he was perceptive and wise and understood the times, but because he was like some kind of super terrestrial being who could see the future. Extraterrestrial being, excuse me. And if we go too much on God's humanity, too much on his humanity, not enough on his divinity, then we're ending up with this person who is simply an enlightened human, and many religions, frankly, teach that about Jesus. The sweet spot, though hard to find, is that he's both, and yet that's mathematically impossible. So here's my question. If it's true that God, in a sense, learned left-handed power himself, or at least we see that script in the narrative, and that people were learning that about God, is it possible that Jesus, when he was born, was kind of flushed of his capacity to just know this? Is it possible that as he was running around playing with blocks as a 2-year-old, he had no idea that God's way was going to be a cross? Is it possible that at 30 years old, when his messiahship finally started, he did the things that messiahs, or at least what was expected of messiahs, do? Big teachings, big miracles, lots of crowds, big stuff going on. In fact, I think one of the important questions is to ask, why early in Jesus' ministry was he surrounded by crowds, and later he was by himself? I mean, he basically had his mom in his last day of life. What happened there? Well, is it possible that early in his messiahship, it was very right-handed? And we love right-handed stuff. Power and force and coercion, manipulation, making things happen, knocking heads together, big shows. And that there was this transition. See, some would point to there's a decisive point in the gospel narratives, Matthew, Mark, and Luke especially, and it's rare to get a story that's in all three of them. It's even more rare to see three writers really transition the Jesus story around the same point, and yet they all do. And that point is a particular story. Mark tells it. His version of it is that they were tired. We talked this summer how Jesus was kind of contrasting the kind of king Herod is with the kind of king God is. They end up in this remote place, and the disciples come to him. I was going to let somebody tie my arm behind my back, and then I was worried about how tight that person would tie it, and then I realized, like, wait a minute, it's not a forced thing. It's a voluntary thing. So the disciples come to him, they're like, hey, Jesus, but by this time it was late in the day, so the disciples came to him. This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Translation, like, we've got enough water for ourselves, but not them. Get them out of here. They say, send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But Jesus says, well, I got a better idea. How about you feed them? You give them something to eat. To which they said, we got bids from caterers. It's expensive. That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? To which Jesus says, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said 5 and 2 fish. And the rest, as they would say, is history. But here's what happens after that story. Not ever before, but always after. See, if we can agree that the feeding of the 5,000 is very right-handed, well, then what happens is Jesus, he goes away by himself. He sends the disciples in a boat. They're supposed to go back to the other side, the Jewish side. He goes up what they would have called these high places, which just think Canyon Ferry and the cliffs around Canyon Ferry. So he goes up there, and it's this place rabbis and people would go to just be with God. He can see down on the lake, and he can see that his disciples are struggling in a storm, and hours and hours and hours go by. It's almost morning, and finally he's like, I better go rescue those poor saps from this storm. He walks out on the water. They freak out because they think he's some kind of monster coming from the abyss because that's what water represents to them. He calms the storm, right-handed power, and then suddenly they're like, whoa, this guy's more scary than the storm. And then what happens? Well, in Luke's gospel, 2 verses later, for the very first time, he starts talking about dying. He starts talking about, here's how God's going to rescue people from sin. Here's how he's going to defeat evil. I'm going to lose. I'm going to die on a cross. In Mark's gospel, it's 2 chapters later. In Matthew's gospel, it's 2 chapters later. But in every one of them, there's this transition, very right-handed early. And as the story goes on, very left-handed. I mean, I think we can all agree that if the cross is true, and if that's what defeated sin once and for all, defeated evil once and for all, if that's what saves us for our vocational purposes with God, that's a very paradoxical form of power. But here's why I think this matters, and here's what's encouraging to me about this is if that's true of Jesus' story, and again, you got to try it on and wear it and see if you even agree with it, but if that's true, then wouldn't that put wind in our sails as parents and friends and spouses and people trying to wake up every morning and go, hi, God, I'm a control freak, but I understand I don't want to live from a place of control. I want to live from a place of trust. I don't want to live from a place of fear. I want to live from a place of generosity. I want to see the world the way Jesus did. Everywhere he looked, he seemed to see you, God. He wasn't afraid of the world. He embraced it. And he wasn't naive about it either. If Jesus had to learn that, then shouldn't that be encouraging to us to go, whew, okay, so I'm broken to the degree that we're all broken, but Jesus, the journey is learning how to lead from left-handed power. And what makes sense about this to me is right-handed power is clear, isn't it? That's why we love our policies and our things to do and things not to do. Because right-handed power is predetermined. It's defined. You already know what you're supposed to do. You're already justified. But if left-handed power is God's way, then what does that require? Especially between you and the divine. It's far less clear, isn't it? Far more like, okay, Lord, I don't quite know what it looks like in this situation. Okay, God, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to respond to this one. And I know my first inclination as a parent is to go right-handed, pow! But God, maybe that's not your way. You know, the temptations, if you decide to just kind of play with this and see if this works for you, the temptations are another place to look. Because think about the temptations, though admittedly earlier in the narrative. Satan comes to Jesus as his ministry is just getting ready to get started. It says, oh, you're hungry? We'll turn the rocks into bread. Would that be left or right-handed power? And then he says, oh, well, you're the Messiah and you need people to know that? Well, here's what we need to do. Let's take you up to the golden cross on top of the cathedral and you jump. And then because you're God's Messiah, God can't allow something to happen to you. And so he'll, like Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible, save you just before you splat on the ground. And that scene in of itself will demonstrate to the world that you're God. Doesn't that sound better than a cross? right-handed or left-handed power? Oh, well, you want power, Jesus? Bow down and worship me, and I'll give it to you. Right-handed or left-handed power? Some speculate that we know that story, that Jesus told the disciples that story, because upon reflection, and there's no way of knowing this for sure, but what if it frames for Jesus the struggle that was his 3 years? That he himself had before him perpetually the right-handed option and God's left-handed option, and he was very candid in his sense that that was by definition tempting. So here's my challenge. If you decide to mess with this, here's my invitation. We talked about 10 things that you're saying you're grateful to God for every day. I'm really hoping you're doing that. We talked about saying, God, if you need to interrupt my flow and bring some focus, you're welcome to do that. Here's my fun challenge this week, and it could be even fun to take it all the way into Christmas Day. What if you pick a meal a day and eat it with your left hand? Just to remind yourself how absurd this is if it's true. Or shave, or put your contacts in with your left hand, or brush your teeth left-handed. Probably not if you're in the medical profession. Don't do anything left-handed. We would prefer that you not do that. But those of you who write things for a living, by all means, knock yourself out. Start writing with your left hand. Just to provoke conversation between you and God of like, God, am I thinking about the way you use power the way I ought? And God, am I thinking about this whole parenting, spouse, friend, leader, human being thing the way you'd have me? And I get it would be disruptive, and I wouldn't blame you if you say this is idiotic. But if you decide to try this, just eat your cereal every morning with your left hand and see if any good comes from that. I'd like to create a space where you can reflect with God in the moment of silence. So you can do that in your own words, or you can just sit under mine. But God, Lord, we wouldn't be in the room if we didn't have at least some hope that you are who you say you are, and that life with you is the ideal form. And God, our prayer is that this space and the songs and the words and the silliness and the coffee and the whole thing, God, would spark awareness of you in our lives and give us greater clarity as to what it would look like to respond to you accordingly. And so, Lord, I pray for my friends, for myself, that to whatever degree this left versus right hand dichotomy is a helpful paradigm for us, that you'd give us the courage to explore it and the memory to remember to do so. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.